story that continues to brew, and it was really quite astounding. The testimony was really quite astounding. And it was the David Johnston, former Governor General David Johnston, special rapporteur, appeared before the committee that's investigating Chinese election interference. And he appeared to be completely at a loss, not only to understand why everybody is saying there's a conflict of interest here, you great friend of Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau family, you former member of the Trudeau Foundation, you guy who is part of the Ottawa establishment and really is working for Justin Trudeau. And I love how the Conservatives have now describe him as the loyal rapporteur instead of the special rapporteur, because that's what he's doing. So I want to let's watch a bit of this testimony, because this week they had Jenny Kwan, who is an NDP MP from Vancouver East, very NDP writing, but CSIS revealed to her that she was targeted by China, by the communist Chinese government. And she was really mad about this. But CSIS told her. And apparently it didn't tell David Johnston, or David Johnston did not. And Jagmeet Singh, who of course vacillates from one side to the other, can't decide whether he wants to oppose Trudeau or stay in his non-aggression pact with Trudeau. He was there asking some pretty good questions too. And we've got a great question from Michael Cooper, one of my favorite MPs from St. Albert, Edmonton, and he's there as well. So let's have a listen to this.
I want to point out a particularly concerning different conclusion that you arrived at in comparison to Mr. O'Toole, and I want to highlight Mr. O'Toole raised a question of privilege, and he indicated, and I just want to quote a portion of what he said with my time remaining, that the briefing he received from CSIS confirmed to me, this is Mr. O'Toole, what I suspected for quite some time, that my party, several members of my caucus, and I were targets of misinformation and voter suppression, and that was orchestrated by China before and during the 2021 election. So members of the Conservative caucus and himself were targeted. In your report, you find that you, in reference to Mr. Chu, who was, of course, a member of the Conservative Party and a candidate in the 2021 election, that misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source. So we've got two very different conclusions from a CSIS briefing that Mr. O'Toole is referring to, and then you're stating in your report that there was no clear evidence that it was state-sponsored. How could you have such different conclusions from what Mr. O'Toole received?
Well, again, Madam Chair, I appreciate that particular question, and I've asked to be brief. We did have an opportunity to meet with Mr. O'Toole shortly before our report was completed, and did take into consideration what he had to say to us. And I must say he has been a very knowledgeable, thoughtful person about this and has much more to contribute. The evidence that we had before us that permitted us to come to the conclusion you've suggested was what was available to us at that time. I think since that time, the conversations that Mr. O'Toole has had with the director of CSIS, I think there's been a much greater step in terms of what should have been done and what must be done in the future.
Thank you.
Now, if we can just listen to this, does Mr. Johnston not appear to be completely out of it here? He looks awful. I'm sure there's a great strain of this office, probably more strenuous than the office of Governor General, which he held for a number of years. But he looks like he is really not doing very well. But is it because his hands are tied and he just simply can't tell the whole truth? If you read his report, it's like he just read the newspapers, the media clippings, the internet stories. There's no intelligence there. There's no information. There's no special information. It's just all he's doing is paraphrasing and regurgitating the news stories. So it's difficult to know what the point was. But let's listen to Michael Cooper here as he continues.
With respect to that, The information that we had did not permit us to conclude that there was a state-sponsored source. There may be other information that would make that clear, but that was not clear to us at the time.
Communist Party media accounts with one account having 26 million followers, but you made the unequivocal statement that there was nothing to indicate recirculation and amplification by the Beijing regime. You further cite on page 25 of your report that in reference to the misinformation directed at then Member of Parliament Kenny Chiu, that it too could, quote, not be traced to a state-sponsored source, even though, Mr. Johnston, were you not aware that on September 10th, an account associated with HuiNet, I'm mispronouncing it, but HuiNet, which is connected to the United Front Work Department, posted disinformation from another Global Times article, this time targeted at Kenny Chiu, and yet you make that unequivocal statement in your report. How is that possible?
Madam Chair, through you, let me refer specifically to what we said on that matter on page 25. Chinese Canadian MPs, including Mr. Chiu, were and remain of particular interest to the PRC. There was online misinformation about Mr. Chiu's proposed foreign agent legislation, which he corrected in the media during the campaign. But the misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source. The government does not regulate consumption of social media during elections or otherwise. However, it has engaged with social media platforms to deal with misinformation and the threat that it poses to election security. This does not include WeChat, which is based in the PRC.
I read the report several times over. Quoting it again, to me, is not going to answer that question. My question was, did Mr. Johnston look into who changed that memo and why it was changed?
Madam Chair, again, I must be conscious of the classified information. The memo that appeared in Global News
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a second here, Madam Chair. It's a yes or no question. Did Mr. Johnston look into who changed it? Yes or no?
The answer to that question is the memo that was referred to in the Global News report was an early draft that had certain statements. The draft was not circulated further. There was a final draft that completed to quite a different conclusion of what transpired.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could just finish my thought, then I take that to mean that Mr. Johnston did not ask the question who changed it and why it was changed.
Yeah, that's absolutely tortuous. You know, it's difficult to watch. And I've got to say, until Johnston took this position as special rapporteur, which I think Canadians had never even heard of this position before. But Justin Trudeau obviously was advised to, I'm sure he had never heard of it before either. But before Johnston took this role, I had a fairly positive impression of him because Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, had appointed so many yahoos into the post of Governor General that he seemed like a refreshing change. This was seemed like a fairly normal guy, and didn't have apparently far left politics or these horrible axes to grind. But I had no idea that David Johnston was so enamored of Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau family, and was such basically a liberal insider. I had no idea. When he took on this role, all of that information came out, and came out quickly, like a flood. Because we know he has no credibility now. And he looks like a man struggling to find his place as he gives his testimony. He looks like a man who's barely there. He looks like a man who's lost his credibility. He once had fairly good standing, a fairly good public stature, and he's lost that because he looks like he's been bought by Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government. He looks like a man who's in Trudeau's pocket. And he didn't need to do this. I don't think he needed the money. And I wonder why he took this job, knowing full well, if he's even half as intelligent as Trudeau says he is, that people are going to figure this out pretty quickly. And the media is going to dig and discover all of those skeletons in his closet. And I mean, the guy has been hiring liberal people who have donated, liberal donors, onto his staff. He hired a crisis management team before there was even a crisis to manage. Obviously, he was expecting one. So he's lost all credibility in this process, and it's quite sad. It really is quite sad. But sad or not, he needs to go. And he needs to listen to Parliament, which voted overwhelmingly last week that he should go. Trudeau can ignore that. He can ignore that. But they do that at their peril, because that is contrary to all good democratic tradition and democratic history in Canada. The Liberals are in a minority position, and they have to remember that. I hope you're enjoying this channel as much as I enjoy putting the material on here. This is not just about politics. I sing some of my favorite songs from the Great American Songbook. And you can also watch my latest show where we do some of the news you're not going to hear anywhere else. But please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. If you want to be part of this station, please be a subscriber. We want you.